The next speaker is Phil Weigall. Now, Philip's been fishing all his life. He loves catching trout. His first trout was caught in the Delatite here. He was only 6. He's caught a few since. For 35 years, he's worked as a guide, a rider. He's been fly fishing his whole full-time career. Philip's now a world-renowned trout fishing legend. He's published 10 books on fly fishing for trout. He's been on advisory committees for recreational fishing and public land management for a long time. He's been involved in the Victoria's Wild Trout program. Spends most of his time fishing here in Victoria, and why wouldn't you? His presentation is titled Past, Present and Future, Learning from a Great Diarist. So let's explore that with him, and welcome to you, Phil.
There's a couple of things that aren't in my notes, and the first one is the Great Diarist thing wasn't my heading. Good, okay, great, don't know. And the second thing is, listening to Taylor made me think front and centre, you know, we are fortunate that we have a government fisheries authority that is pro-trout in word and in deed. So if you look around the rest of the country, that isn't always the case. So we should never lose sight of how valuable that is. How much we agree with them or not, that's another matter, but don't lose sight of the fact that that is a very, very fortunate place to be in this day and age. Not just pro-fishing, but also pro-trout. So, but on to the main talk. In the dead of winter, when I daydream about trout streams, which I do a little bit, I guess I probably, like most of us, picture the ideal river. Clear, cool, not too high, not too low, not too warm, not too cold, maybe with a trout or three rising. But if I look back through the fishing diaries I've kept for 40 years, or as I sometimes think of them, the truth serum, it shows me that the perfect trout stream isn't always there. Or to look at it another way, what we've experienced over the last 3 years or so isn't always the norm. So in reality, we know intellectually, if not emotionally, that the trout fishing environment is constantly changing, as Taylor's graphs and notes showed us, but I want to stress it. Sometimes it's wetter and cooler, sometimes hotter and drier, and sometimes in between. As much as we might like to, we can't stop those tougher times from happening. We can't stop the droughts, we can't stop the heat waves, or at least I can't. But I'm very optimistic all the same, because there's lots that we can do to make things better. We're not helpless. It's not something we've got no control over. And there's a couple of different facets to that I'm going to talk about. First of all, I want to talk about strategies to improve your catch rates when things get challenging out in the water, not only by making changes to where we fish, but very, very importantly, how we fish. And second, I want to touch on, and a lot of other people will be doing this over the course of the day, but I want to touch on what we as anglers can do to make waterways and their trout more resilient during those harsher seasons. I really do think that is worth having front of mind right through this. So first up though, we're going to have a look at, see if I can get little zingy to work. Yeah, I did. There it goes. Didn't push it hard enough. A look back through last season, because it really is... Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm really good at this technological stuff. Looking back on last season, because it's a bit of a snapshot of this fly fishing or trout fishing roller coaster. It started really well. So I began my fishing last season in Western Victoria on the tributaries of the Barwon River, not far from my home. and in the Otways in October. And it was really good, really good. The river levels were surprisingly friendly for early in the season. There were plenty of fish about, and we had some great fishing. But there's the but, and the but is I'm always a bit nervous when things are perfect early, because really, for the whole season's benefit, I would rather we had lots of water, maybe a little bit discoloured, maybe a little bit on the cold side, because that's money in the bank for when things get tough normally, which is the middle of summer. And then I moved up to fish the northeast rivers in sort of late spring, and again, really good. Look at that photo, the hauka looking like an absolute dream. But, you know, even by then, I would have liked a little bit more water and a little bit more colour. It was getting a bit too much like late December for my liking. So I wonder what was going to happen. And despite the El Nino forecast, thankfully, some rain arrived. We got about 5 inches in December and 10 inches on Mount Buller in January. So that was a saviour. Things could have gone very, very differently without those wet and relatively cool weather systems. Mount Buller never got over about 21 degrees, and we had very few consecutive hot days. They're the two enemies, I suppose, in a bad year, is not only maximum temperatures, but duration of hot weather, because that water is relatively difficult to heat and to cool, but if you put enough heat on it for long enough, you get that warm water that we don't like. So summer ended with the streams getting a bit low, but not critically so. So the fishing was still okay. We were catching some nice trout, but towards the end of this sort of late summer, early autumn period, I began to hear from the less experienced anglers and those that don't move around much, I can't see the trout, I can't catch them, so therefore they are gone. That was like a statement of fact. And this pattern continued more or less until the season's end. The rivers were low and skinny and clear, except for the tailwaters, which just fished well all the way through, the likes of the Midder and the Goulburn. Artificially regulated. Temperature wasn't a problem, but the water was low and clear. So last season was a very good example of the trout fishing roller coaster. It's a bit of a microcosm, really. And these two pictures sort of show the extremes over the course of decades. And the slide on the left is the upper Midder or Big River near Middle Creek, just after the awful alpine fires in 2003. I mean, the landscape was incinerated, and the Midder was really the only sign of life in that whole landscape, just this ribbon of water winding through. It was still flowing incredibly and still had trout in it incredibly. And then we don't have to go back too far to find the other extreme, which was spring of 2022, where the challenge if you wanted to go trout fishing was A, could you actually get to the water because of flooded roads and washed out roads? And B, once you got there, how did you fish in all that chaos of flow and cold and discolour? So when things are not perfect, how do we respond? Location is a big thing, you know. I'll say it at the start, I think adaptability is certainly a quality that's more important than sentimentality when it comes to being a trout fisher. If you're sentimental, and that's fine, but sentimentality, I always fish the Ovens River at Bright in February. That's where we've been going as a family for the last, however many years. That's what we do. We go up there Australia Day weekend or whatever, and that's where we fish. That's where we're going. It's months away, but that's already where we're going to go. Now, if you want to go down that path, that's fine by me, but you can't really then say, oh, gee, the fishing's tough, because maybe it will be, maybe it won't be. But if your objective is to catch fish, you need to have some flexibility and you need to make decisions about where you're going to go closer to the time you are going to go, when you can see what the levels and what the conditions are likely to be, and adapt accordingly. So if the water's too high, if the rivers are running a banker, you're really going to struggle in those upper reaches. You'll be fishing in torrents, you'll have very little access along the bank, you might not even be able to get in there in the first place, aka, 2022. Lower down, you will find those softer edges, and of course things like water temperature are not going to be a problem in those conditions. Low water, that's the Snowy Creek on the right there during a drought. Go upstream and look for the catchments that have had more rainfall and try and focus your fishing on those. It makes all the difference. The low flow channel tends to be a better fit, so if the river is low, you don't have sort of 50 metres of exposed gravel. As you can see, it pretty much fits the bed. And of course the fish are happy, they've got cool water, they've got canopy, they've got cover, and they're the places to go. If the water's too warm, again, the tailwaters, so the water coming out of the bottom of the dams is cooler than elsewhere, so rivers like the Goulburn and the Midder, below Dartmouth and below Eildon. And the upper reaches. Further up you go, the more shade, the more elevation, all these things working to keep the water cooler. So you'll find cooler water upstream and happier trout. Conversely, when the water's too cold, which it is in a lot of streams at the moment, I think Mark was telling me Snobs Creek is running at 7 degrees at the moment. The Rubicon and Acheron, where I've been fishing lately, 9 degrees or thereabouts. That's cold. Now, trout aren't threatened by cold, but their activity, they're cold-blooded, so when things start to get really cold, they aren't as active. And if they're not as active, they're not as easily catchable. So if you can find water that's somewhat warmer, ironically, at this time of year, you'll find better fishing. And that's usually going to be further downstream. And as I say, be adaptable, not sentimental. In terms of techniques, in big water, when the flows are high, find those velocity refuges, which is a fancy way of saying places a little bit out of the current or protected from the current. And they're not always in your face, like the soft edges along the sides of the rivers, that's pretty obvious, but the way in which obstructions in the riverbed help provide cover from the current for trout is remarkable. And they won't just be behind the boulders and the logs that are stuck in the riverbed, they'll also be in front. There's this little sort of peeling off of the current ahead. And some of the very best fish will sit in front of those obstructions. So look for those. And the other thing that never ceased to amaze me as a kid, and still does really, is that actually in those really fast currents, the stream bed often has very little flow. There's a sort of friction effect happening there. So being right on the bottom of the river helps the fish get out of the current. So if you can get your offerings right down, and I mean bouncing along the bottom, you'll catch a lot more fish than if your offerings are a foot off the bottom. So getting right down deep can be the difference between success and failure under those conditions. Dirty water. I'm, again, always amazed at how well trout can find things in dirty water. But then again, I guess they've been doing it for a few million years. So I'm not as obsessed as I used to be about having lots of size and flash and bulk to my flies when I'm fishing in dirty water. But it still doesn't hurt to have a little bit of splash, a little bit of colour, and a little bit of inherent movement, a bit of wiggle. Sometimes I think it's more about the fly standing out as something other than debris. So if you look at a high-flowing stream, you'll see the bits and pieces, bits of bark, bits of grass, all the non-food items coming down the river. But if you get something that stands out from the junk, if you like, that's going to help the fish find it and eat it. Now, low water. This is where you've really got to bring your A game. basically, when the water gets low and clear, trout have a genetic memory that this is basically a dangerous time, because unlike when the flows are strong and the water's got a bit of colour, they're very obvious to their predators, most of which attack from the outside world. So if you're fishing under those low clear conditions like we had towards the end of last season, fish like a ninja. You know, the trout, don't be obvious as someone that's up to no good. You don't want the trout to know that. So move slowly, keep flash to a minimum. You don't have to wear full camo, but leave the bright clothes, bright caps, flashy jewellery at home, because they're the things that are going to alert the trout to danger. And most of the time, trout will respond to any possible, even I'd say aberration, let alone overt threat, by fleeing. Because the line of trout that sort of said, oh, what's that? Well, they became extinct quite a long time ago. So be careful, blend in, stay off the horizon. Makes a heck of a difference if the trout don't know that someone up to no good's nearby. Fish the cover. Fish the places where the trout feels safe, rather than, you know, the middle of a deep, clear pool in the middle of the day. And if all else fails, low light's your friend. So if it's been really tough during the day, come back on evening and you'll see just how many trout are in the stream. They'll come up right on dark to eat the bugs and things that in turn have been laying low because they're easy targets, and you'll get a good opportunity to catch them, because low light is definitely a time when trout, even in low clear water, are feeling happy. Cormorants, or as I think of them, the Black Plague. Yep, don't like them. But you know what? Like heat waves and droughts and fires, they're part of playing in the outdoors. They're just part of life. I had a thought, you know, we could build a trout stream down the middle of Chadstone Shopping Centre. It'd be 20 degrees all year long, never rain, wouldn't be windy, no cormorants, you know. Do you think we'd fish it very much? I don't think so. Because part of what we do is about being out in nature, and like it or not, cormorants are part of nature. They come and they go. I think maybe something like a 10-year cycle, although that's probably even then me as a human trying to tidy up, give some predictability to a natural phenomena. So, yep, don't like them. Don't like it when I see a cormorant on the river I'm fishing, because they're competition basically, aren't they? And I'm sure they scare the fish, and I'm sure they eat the fish. But just like droughts and heat waves and floods, they are a fact of our fishing life, and there are really practical things we can do when the cormorants have been about to improve our fishing. And I guess it's only bleeding obvious when it's explained to you, but strategies that target the water that the cormorants find it hard to fish in is not a bad way to go, because not only will those areas have not been hit as hard by the cormorants, but the fish themselves, I'm quite convinced, learn, because again, they've got, you know, a few million years of doing this, they learn how to get into the areas where they're harder to target. And that water on the right, fishing with JD in March, in the middle of the cormorants season last year, that is really good cormorant avoidance water. It's fairly shallow, it's got lots of rocks, and the special subject for cormorants, I think, when I've watched them hunting, and I have, is speed through open water. That's what they're really good at. They're frighteningly fast. They're like a missile, literally. Wings folded back, legs out the back, beak out the front, phew, through the water they go, and they run down trout. I've seen them do it. They can't do that very well in there. It's not as easy. Nor is it as easy in a log jam or under an undercut bank, places where they physically can't fit, in amongst boulders. So think to yourself, when cormorants about, where are the cormorants going to find it hard? And really concentrate your effort in those places. And conveniently, I have a little story to tell you. from last week. So my boys are loving their fly fishing, and they've still got a little bit to learn though, and you won't believe this, but Dad isn't always right in their general lives. And they said, we're going down to little stream such and such, where do you think we should go? And I said, well, I don't know, I haven't been there for months, but if the cormorants have been about, I reckon they'll be in this stretch, which has got a lot of, clutter, basically. It's a bit awkward to fish, right? Hard back cast, have to climb over the logs, but there's a lot of cover. The cormorants won't have been able to work there as well. Oh, okay, and off they drove. And I was in Ballarat doing something, and after an hour I got a phone call. Oh, Dad, we're not catching any, we're not seeing any. And I said, oh, that's surprising. Where are you fishing? And they said, well, we went to our favourite bit. And their favourite bit is their favourite bit because it's open, right? There's not many trees. It's very pretty, but there's not much structure. And if there's no cormorants about, no worries. But there have been cormorants around. And I said, well, I don't think you should be fishing there. But I said, given that you are, I said, what you're going to have to do is find those few patches where there's some really good cover, the overhanging trees, the undercut banks, log jams, and you're going to have to fish really carefully to those and ignore the nice comfy water. And 10 minutes later, I got the phone call on the photo that you see before you. So they put that into practice and they caught a couple of fish before they had to go to work. So, it does work. And that leads fairly conveniently to the second big thing we can do. So there's how we fish and where we fish. But as anglers, part 2 is supporting making life better for fish, for trout. In other words, softening that variability, those big up and downs in the graphs of temperatures and flows and all the rest of it. We can just take the sharp edges off a little bit by making troutland a happier place for the fish to be. And as Taylor so importantly points out, in the process of doing this, we are also doing good environmental work generally. I can't think of any habitat project that I've been involved with or have looked on to over the last few decades that hasn't been beneficial to numerous species, including indigenous species. And I can think of a few where endangered species have reappeared as a result of work that was done for the benefit of trout. And in the interests of social licence, that's a really important side benefit. Like, the main objective, as far as I'm concerned, is to make things better for the trout so that the fishing's better, because that's what I want, better fishing. But along the way, it is a very, very important side benefit that we make things better for all species. We're doing the environment a favour. In-stream structure, trees for shade and cover, talk more about that in a moment. And where possible, we should advocate for better minimum flows. So reduce extraction of water and increase releases of water from things like our reservoirs, because minimum flows have a big impact on how many fish a water can hold. So this is a really good example a couple of years back of the value of in-stream habitat. So after the 2020 fires, the area around Corryong was absolutely nuked. As Shay will tell you, it was quite distressing actually, how hard it was hit. And it seemed almost frivolous to be worried about the fish, but it's a beautiful area to fish, and seeing it just after the fires, it was pretty beaten up. Wasn't so much the fires, but the rain and the floods that came afterwards, as so often happens, are the real, punch in the gut. And the Narrial Creek was one of those really beaten up waterways. The CMA got in there and put in serious structure, log jams, rip-rap, that is big boulders, and that's what you can see behind me there. Now, a lot of the river when I fished it back then was just like, I liken it to a flooded gravel road. Very featureless, not a good place if you're a fish of any description, let alone a trout. But with this sort of stuff, there's places to hide. There's those velocity refuges I talked about. There's overhead cover from predators. And so all these things make for happier trout. You may not be able to stop a bushfire, but you can do stuff after the bushfire to make it easier for the trout to recover. And hand on heart, I fished for hundreds of metres before this spot and caught nothing, got to this spot and caught 2 on 4 casts. And it makes perfect sense. Where else would you want to be if you're a trout under those conditions? So having that physical habitat we're not just paying lip service, oh yeah, I guess we'll do something. This is the real game-changing stuff if you can do it right. And our CMAs do some fantastic work in this space, and they'll be doing it for all the fish, not just for trout, but we should support it because trout will undoubtedly be beneficiaries. Trees, they are gold. And the more we learn about trees, the more we realise their value. So the big one, of course, is shade, as Taylor touched on. If you take direct sunlight off a stream, you can have a massive influence on its temperature. And to my great surprise, looking at my diaries, I've found examples where, surprising to me, and maybe to you as well, even kilometres of shaded water downstream, so you can have the water flowing in warm and be a few degrees colder when it flows out the other end. So it doesn't even have to be from top of the catchment down, even though that would be the preference, because it's a lot easier to keep cold water cool than to cool it down once it's warmed up. But nevertheless, there's a few spots where I fish. If I get below that revegetated water, the water is cooler than it is before it goes in from the open country. So trees are fantastic. Trees are one area where we can actually physically do something as anglers. We may not be able to get in with excavators and put giant logs and boulders in the stream, but we can get in there and help plant trees. And the Trout Foundation have just been magnificent with this. And yeah, if you really want to do something good for trout physically, then plant trees because it's undoubtedly a game changer. And I talked about minimum flows, and we're having some wins in this space too, 400 megalitres a day versus 160 on the Goulburn. Minimum flows are often what determines the carrying capacity of a stream. Doesn't matter, it might be 9,000 megalitres a day in the middle of summer. If it's 160 in the middle of winter, the 160 is probably having a very big influence on how many fish that waterway can hold. So where we can advocate and support minimum flows, and where there's serious extraction, and which happens from time to time, much less because the CMAs and so forth are onto it, but where people are ripping out much more water out of a river than they should, then, that's something we definitely should be opposed to. Look, I think Taylor covered the stocking thing pretty well. It's an appealing solution intuitively, because it just seems to make perfect sense. If there's no fish, put some in and suddenly there are fish. But for lots of reasons, lots of good reasons, it is not a terribly effective solution. And conversely, the power of trout to come back themselves is just beggars belief, especially over the last few years. I've caught trout in streams where I'm quite sure they had been gone for some time and they've come back. And they come back because of this incredible breeding capacity of trout. So ironically, over the last few years, as this diagram shows, most of the baby trout are cannon fodder, right? They die. So there's too much competition. All the big trout say, get out of my spot, go and hide in the shallows where all the predators and herons and things can get you. Where there's no food, that's where you've got to live because, we've got this water, we're the big ones. But then when you have a disaster, like those 2020 fires, the few surviving trout, suddenly all their babies have got the run of the place. They've got the pick of the cover, the pick of the food, and you have this amazing effect. Who remembers sea monkeys? Yeah. So I think it's like sea monkeys. It's like this miracle where you sort of just add water and poof, you know, a few months later the trout are there. And they do not like a vacuum. I think Rob from Tasmania is here, and he'll tell you that in Tassie it is intriguing some of the places that trout fight their way into. Now, it must be a suicide mission in some of those upper western lakes for this little baby trout to go, well, I'm going to swim across what's virtually wet grass and hope at the end of it I find a pond to live in. But they do, right? That's they've got that sort of competitive pressure and that sort of wanderlust. And they will try to, if the habitat's right, they will recolonise it. So they're very good at it. So I think stocking's not necessarily the solution. Maybe we should give fry a try from time to time because it's cheap and not too resource intensive. We're not directing too much effort away from other important stuff. But hand on heart, I don't really think on our healthy wild streams it's going to make a difference. We're in a very good place with catch regulations. I know that a bit like compliance and enforcement, too much is never enough, but I do think really where we are now compared to 1997 is remarkable. I mean, we've got those total fishing closures. You can't fish at all on the tailwaters like the Midder and the Goulburn and their tributaries, right? So that's pretty big. We're saying to people who fish for other species, you can't fish here over winter. You can't. No one's allowed to fish. Doesn't matter if you're not a trout fisher, you're not allowed to fish. So that's pretty big. We've got a number of streams now like the Rubicon where there's a 3 trout limit. So that's getting there. That's getting to be a pretty tight limit, you know, for trout. I think probably historically the tightest limit we've had. And I like the maximum size limits because I still think these big fish or bigger fish are really, really valuable. And this is my boys, you know, they let them go. And, you know, who am I to say no to that? So I think the catch regs are really good. Yeah, you could tweak them a bit here and there, but I don't think they're a problem we need to concern ourselves with anymore. Yeah, so to sum up, I think to ride the ups and downs, the key word from an angling point of view is to be adaptable. Think about where you're fishing and how you're fishing. You might love fishing dry fly, but if the river's in semi-flood, it's probably not going to work. So you need to adapt how you fish. And equally important, support anything that improves the habitat for trout. Because it sounds, probably not so much now, probably did 10 years ago, it sounds like lip service, but I really do believe, and I've seen it time and time and time again, that if you get the habitat right, if you when we have got the power to do it incredibly, you can really take those sharp edges off the hard times, the hot summers, the dry summers. You can make life happier in troutland for the fish. And in doing so, also help the social licence of trout fishing because in the process we're helping other species. So, yeah, that's it.